and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding, and today I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Professor Nick Groom. Now, amongst the many things that Nick has done, and we'll be touching on some of them, is he is the author of the newly republished and updated 21st Century Tolkien, What Middle-earth Means to Us Today, and that's going to be the centre of what we're talking about. But Nick, you are actually talking to us from Macau because you are at the university there. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up on the opposite side of the world to Tolkien?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm delighted to be here, Julia, so thank you so much for inviting me to join you. So I started my career at Oxford University, where I studied 18th century literature with Professor Roger Lonsdale. In those days, this was the 1980s, early 1990s, Tolkien was pretty much ignored by Oxford. So any sort of hope that I had of studying him there were very soon dashed. In fact, there were no walking tours. There weren't any special, sort of like areas of bookstores devoted to him. And one day when I was a graduate student, I noticed that the Oxfam shop on St Giles was actually selling Tolkien letters. Sadly, I had so little money, I couldn't afford to buy any. But somebody had clearly sorted out their filing cabinet and had just dumped these papers in the Oxfam shop. Some regrets about that, but as I say, I had so little money at the time, it just wasn't possible.
Could I just interject there? There is a connection, I don't know if you know this, between Tolkien and the founding of Oxfam.
Oh, I didn't know that, no.
Which is that his daughter Priscilla was one of the very first collectors for Oxfam during the war when they were collecting for relief of the Greek famine.
Oh, interesting.
He helped establish it. And one of the very first people to give a sizable donation was C.S. Lewis.
Right.
Who gave something like a huge amount for the time, like £500 or something. So yeah, that was very fitting that they were then selling his letters.
Well, I wish I could have made a donation myself to acquire them, but it just wasn't possible at the time. So I then moved from Oxford to teach at the University of Exeter, and any hopes of teaching Tolkien were also dashed as a sort of junior lecturer. I worked at Bristol and also in Stanford and Chicago. In fact, it was just as I was finishing at Bristol and just before I returned back to Exeter that I thought, well, I'm senior enough. I might as well just give it a go, see if I can teach Lord of the Rings just at the end of a course on English identities. And I was delighted for two reasons. First of all, that the students were very responsive, and that's clearly what they wanted to be studying. And secondly, that the book wasn't a disappointment, having taught a whole variety of not just modern fiction, 18th century poetry, Shakespeare, but I certainly saw that it would stand up to serious critical scrutiny. So then when I returned to Exeter, I started developing a course devoted to Tolkien, using Tolkien as a way to introduce the students to Anglo-Saxon and Middle English writings. And I taught that for a few years. And then I began to realize that more and more students were coming to that, having seen the movies first. And rather than say that this was wrong, I thought, well, this is actually inevitable. So I developed the course, so it then included a number of adaptations as well. And that's the course that I'm actually now teaching in Macau. So I moved to Macau in 2020. Partly because I wanted to change. I'd always been interested in international students. And also I wanted to give myself some challenges, really. And also my children the opportunity to see the world from different perspectives. So I also found coming here that the students were just as keen to study Tolkien as they were back in Britain. So I have been teaching the course. In fact, tomorrow I'll be teaching the Battle of Maldon, and then the Homecoming after that. So we do follow the same sort of pattern, looking at the Tolkien's influences and some of his other critical and creative work before we move on to the Lord of the Rings and then the various adaptations of it.
So just we got a non-specialist audience listening. So the Battle of Maldon is an Anglo-Saxon poem, and the Homecoming of, how do you say that? Beornoth?
I think it's Beornoth.
Beornoth is a drama, short drama, which Tolkien wrote, which is like a spin-off. His adaptation of the Battle of Maldon. So that's absolutely fascinating. So I noticed you said you moved in 2020. Am I wrong in thinking you were butting up against COVID when you moved?
Within 2 weeks, COVID had followed me here, and indeed was spreading around the world. So it wasn't the happiest of times, but we made it.
Tough beginning. So your book charts the writing of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings with a sort of academic interest to start with. I would say that if you want to gen up on a kind of modern way of looking at the writing and reception and possible interpretation of the book, this is a great paperback to buy. But you also then go on to do what lots of people really want to read about, which is have a serious attention to the various adaptations. So we're going to start first of all with the material, which is the kind of thing that you wanted to do at university and were not allowed, but are now doing. And that is looking at how the context of the composition of these novels and where they fit amongst other 20th century books at the same time, how that's enriched your understanding. I just wanted to particularly start this by your wonderful jaw-dropping moment, a bit of a mic drop moment, where you talk about how when you reach the appendices in Return of the King, if you're following him and you're sticking with it, you suddenly find out that actually Tolkien admits to having translated his story from Westron, common speech English. So the Shire is not really the Shire, but Susa. And Sam, short for Samwise from the Anglo-Saxon, is not really Sam, but Ban, Banazir. All words based on the ancient Gothic language. And you're making the argument here that you've got suddenly you're chucked out of a familiar world into this unfamiliar, and you call it the mise en abîme, the idea of suddenly you're dropping through a world into the abyss, which was great. I'd forgotten, well, not forgotten, but not really thought about it in what a rude shock that is when you read that. So what have you found by treating Lord of the Rings as a serious literary work? What kind of sides has it made you think about the book, where it sits within 20th century literature?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, of course, the tradition of Tolkien criticism and scholarship has really been led by those working on earlier literature, such as Anglo-Saxon medieval period, as a way of hunting for Tolkien's sources and showing how inventively and creatively he adapted materials, and also as a gateway to introduce readers to that earlier period of literature. So in that sense, sort of Tolkien's a bit of a godsend for medievalists because it encourages readers to return to that period. But I really felt that Tolkien as a stylist, as a creative writer, had been overlooked. Because what those studies do, they tend to take him out of the 20th century and put him into a rather sort of a separate or a unique or an individual category. And so he's not treated as part of the literary history of the 20th century. In fact, this is changing. This has been changing over the past few years, but certainly when I was studying and first teaching 20th century literature, there'd be a focus on what we call the modernists, and many writers who you might be familiar with were excluded from that. There used to be an emphasis on, Eliot, Joyce, Woolf, maybe D.H. Lawrence, kind of some controversial figure these days. Lately, perhaps William Golding. But university courses haven't been very good at including not only Tolkien but also writers like George Orwell, for example, who are similarly internationally well known. So I really wanted to see how Tolkien might fit into that literary history, but not just through whether he's using the same sorts of devices, playing the same sorts of language games. Can he be treated alongside somebody like James Joyce? But really to delve further into the way he writes and his particular strengths as a writer. I really believe in the value of literature, and I think that's something that for many critics, this is sort of something which is seen as I don't know, being unfashionable or ideological or whatever. But I think we have to be able to, as critics, have sort of the courage of our convictions and say when we think a writer is good and why they are particularly good. And I thought, well, I must take this to Tolkien and sort of try to argue that Tolkien is as good a writer as his contemporaries, although he may be using different techniques, have a very different perspective on things. So I really wanted to think about those elements. Also, Tolkien's readers get very, is possessive the right word?
Yeah.
They certainly feel very keenly
I think it is.
that Tolkien belongs to them. And this does sentimentalize his writing, and there's a strong identification with many of the characters. But I also, when I was rereading it, I realized not only what a dark book it is, but also how it's full of failure and uncertainty and ambiguity. One of the things that interests me is that Tolkien is described as a world builder. And of course, he has this fantastic linguistic foundation for Middle-earth. He produced maps, which Christopher Tolkien, his son, then drew. He has things like the family trees, the genealogies, even heraldry. He was an artist as well. So there's a big emphasis on how Tolkien creates this sort of really sort of thickly woven, watertight world. But it's not. It's full of loose ends, and it's full of unexplained contradictions, because that's what our world is like. We don't explain everything. We don't have answers for every experience or phenomenon or episode. And I think Tolkien, one of the few writers to actually recognize and identify and express that. He's really, really good at presenting loose ends, but in a way that you don't necessarily notice them. So an obvious example is Tom Bombadil, who simply does not fit in the story. I mean, he is from another world. The ring has no effect on him. He's not interested in it. He has that lovely line when Frodo says, well, why didn't we leave the ring with Tom Bombadil? And Gandalf says, well, he'd just lose it. He's got no interest in these things. Independently, Tolkien did say that, Bombadil does not fit. He's an inexplicable element of the world. He was writing about Tom Bombadil before he wrote Lord of the Rings, and he continued to write about Tom Bombadil after Lord of the Rings, but not in a way that really enhances our understanding of Lord of the Rings, except to demonstrate that we're only getting a partial view of this world. We only get a partial view of Middle-earth. We're not seeing the whole of Middle-earth. A more, I think, subtle example would be the fox that sees Frodo and Sam as they're leaving the Shire. And all of a sudden, you're in the mind of this fox who's thinking, isn't it strange that these hobbits are out at this time of night? And then Tolkien says, well, why they were out, the fox never learnt. And so we suddenly realize that sort of foxes are sentient. They're having their own experiences. They're looking at the world in a particular sort of foxy way. And so you get a perspective on things that doesn't explain the story, but it deepens it by showing us there are things that we're not understanding and there are things that aren't being explained. I think a third example.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Hold that. I was just going to come in at the fox here. So I come at it from the point of view of a novelist. That's what I do in my profession. And I've been doing a sidecast going through Lord of the Rings, looking at it like you're looking at the back of a tapestry, trying to sort of see the joins. And the fox episode, when you put it alongside the framing device, which he settles on towards the end, that these are the accounts of Frodo and Bilbo and their friends.
Yeah.
So the idea is that the reason you get the multiple points of view and dipping into different people's heads in different moments is because they've gathered it all together like a kind of group chat about what happened. The thing that doesn't quite fit is the fox, because unless he's a friend, but I think it is showing the working of it having started as a children's story. So those kind of quirky elements were much more at home in The Hobbit than they were in the sort of maturer Lord of the Rings material. So I that framing device is quite radical as well, because it does mean that it's not a universal narrator.
No.
Not a Dickens style narrator who sits above, or Tolstoy or somebody. It's not that. It's always at the point of view of a character, but someone has woven the stories together, and the play is that you imagine it being Frodo in his few years after the end of the adventure, before he goes off to the Undying Lands, and then Sam. So that, again, going to your literary techniques, is a very interesting set of narratorial ambiguities, shifting focuses, which is much more of a modern 20th century novel practice.
It is, I think, and you see it a lot in Virginia Woolf, for example, at the beginning of Mrs. Dalloway, because we're very frequently being given those perspectives of different characters. Sometimes it's made clear. So I talk about Gimli and Legolas in the book, that Gimli has what I call a dwarrocentric perspective, in which he's using the topography of rocks and stone and so forth, as a way not only of comprehending the world, but in terms of defining beauty and value. Whereas, of course, Legolas's perception is alvocentric. It's the elf view of the world, and is much more related to trees, to nature and so forth. And that's why they can't really see as the other sees. They can't appreciate. They try to, but they can't appreciate the beauty. Legolas can't appreciate grottos, and Gimli is frightened of being in the forest. So Tolkien makes that quite clear in that case. So he's clearly self-conscious and aware of it. But it also happens in other instances as well, I think, where many times we're not being we're not aware that we're seeing things from a character's point of view. I think that's really important. Again, another example would be Treebeard. Treebeard talks about nobody cares about the trees. He gives the view from the forest. There's a lovely interview on YouTube where Tolkien says that he'd like to have a chat with the tree to see what the tree really thinks about things. So, again, he's aware of that. One of the more interesting elements of this is when Aragorn is talking about the Black Riders, the Ringwraiths, and he says, they have different senses to us. They don't see things in the same way. They have different senses, and so they're experiencing the world in a different way than the hobbits or Aragorn might. So I think that it's not just a sort of a modern, it's a very sort of contemporary for the 21st century to be thinking about these alternative viewpoints and really trying to show that the human perspective is only one among many. It's clearly only one among many in Middle-earth, because there are a number of intelligent species. And I call them species. I'm not going to call them races, because I don't think you can say that elves and humans are simply different races. That's like saying that sort of vampires, ghosts, and humans are different races. Elves are immortal. Elves can walk across snow. Elves can sleep while they're journeying. So they are clearly different species to humans. I think that even within those species, there are many different races. There are clearly many races. As the humans in the Lord of the Rings, there are different races of elves. Legolas, for example, says that the Hollin elves are a strange race. They're sort of unfamiliar to the Sylvan elves. And we end up with this multiplicity, a very diverse range of perspectives, which I think is really exciting. And I think we are undervaluing Tolkien if we're not really appreciating and enjoying those different perspectives and seeing that, yes, it is it's a way of making the human perspective just relative, but it's one among many.
For human read Hobbit. I think that you mentioned rightly the amount of poetry, and I think the poetry connects to this because some of that poetry gives access to the worldviews of the culture from which they come. So Gimli expresses his Dwaro-centric view in a number of ways, but one of them, of course, is singing the wonderful song or chanting the song in Moria about the great kingdom of the past. And the elves, of course, they sing in Elvish, and then there's a translation of it, which connects with um, the, s- the the one sort of extended passage of Legolas in the first in Fellowship of the Ring is when he's talking about passing of time, how it's like ripples on the stream. So there is an access through the poetry as well to these worldviews, which is I can't think of another novel that does that.
No, and I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting that when Gimli sings his song, of course, it touches Sam's heart.
Mm.
Sam is quite a poetical character, unexpectedly. And so there are ways in which the different species can communicate through poetry and song. Of course, it's also worth bearing in mind that there aren't many novels that have so much poetry in them. And in terms of book sales, I mean, Tolkien is by far and away the best-selling poet of the 20th century. Uh, but, uh, but people don't sort of really see him in those terms. They might now that the 3-volume edition of the poetry has been edited and published. But he does show himself to be experimenting in a range of different sorts of poetic styles, which is again invigorating. I think it's wonderful to have this novel that contains so many different ways of writing, from the sort of mundane frivolity of Hobbiton to these, almost biblical or apocalyptic battle scenes, which seem to be guided by the hand of fate in the 3rd volume. So yeah, I think he does show himself to have this facility for this range of different voices.
So we could go on talking about Lord of the Rings ad infinitum. There's so much to cover here, but I would really highly recommend people going to buy the book and read these arguments at greater length and also in much depth, because you really do take a serious look, respectful look at Lord of the Rings. And it doesn't when you look at your favorite book, you sometimes worry, am I going to sort of go off this if I, and you'll find new things to love in it, I'm sure. But the sort of second half of your book, if I think it's about the second half, is looking at adaptations. Now, first of all, you make the very good point that we shouldn't treat adaptations of Tolkien as if someone's attacking the source material. We should treat it like adaptations of Hamlet or Macbeth, where suddenly it's a Japanese no drama or something. That's absolutely fine. It's let people play with this material. So let's start with that, which is good introduction to the extraordinary film that was never made by John Boorman. And you go into some depth of the treatment here, which I had never read about. I knew it happened, but I'd never actually sat down and thought, what kind of film would he have come up with? Can you tell us a little bit about this treatment, how it almost got made, and then what it would have been like as a film to watch?
Yeah, sure. But I'll just preface what I'm saying by with two important points. First of all, that the first radio version of the Fellowship of the Ring was actually broadcast before Tolkien had published The Return of the King. So he was fully alive to adaptation. So he wanted to have the works adapted, even though he roundly criticizes the various versions. He nevertheless was keen to get it out to a different sort of audience. And this is, I think, reflected in the film rights, that when he finally sells them. And I make the argument, I think that this is true, that he actually has to sell them to pay a tax bill, because this is when The Lord of the Rings has finally been published as a paperback. And it originally came out as a paperback in the US in a pirated edition. And then there was a campaign to have the official version, so Tolkien would get paid. And then he gets paid too much, and then he gets a tax bill. And one of the things he does is to sell the film rights. And he's been discussing the film rights since the late 1950s. And there are various treatments sent to him which he poo-poos. There comes a point, however, when he doesn't really have a choice. He does have to sell the film rights. But when he does sell them, he has a clause allowing any sort of reworking or adaptation. So there's no stipulation that it has to remain faithful to the text. In fact, he said he'd sell the film rights either for art or cash. So he either wanted to have something that was going to be high art, or it was going to just allow the family to reap the benefits, because in fact they still get a royalty point. This is also very unusual in movie contracts, that the Tolkien estate still has a financial interest in any adaptation. But Tolkien allowed changes to be made. I think that's a really important thing to emphasize. So among when the rights are acquired, one of the filmmakers who's approached is John Boorman, and he's well known these days for films such as Deliverance. But what's interesting about him is, first of all, he was absolutely fanatical about adapting Lord of the Rings. He was extremely keen to do so. He went and took his co-writer to a cottage in Ireland, and they took several copies of the book and cut the pages out and papered the walls with pages. So they're sort of literally living inside the book. He was eating, drinking, breathing Middle Earth during this period. But then the adaptation he comes up with is very, very unusual. And I was lucky enough to get a sight of the script. I'd read a couple of essays about it, which are extremely critical because of the radical changes that were being proposed. But what's interesting is it's a detailed script. It's very visually effective. So if you read the script, you can actually see the film playing. It would have been a short adaptation. It would have just been for one movie. So he's going to have to make massive cuts. And he'd actually wanted to have Tolkien appear at the beginning, almost like a Bilbo character, introducing this particular work. But then it's a very adult film. And so, for example, the scene between Frodo and Galadriel, which Tolkien has there's a very slight hint that there's a romantic interest there, because the Mirror of Galadriel scene takes place on 14th of February, Valentine's Day. Tolkien clearly makes a decision to have it on that particular day, and if you look at the chronology in the appendices, you do get those specific dates, and it's significant that the Company of the Ring leave Rivendell on the 25th of December, that the ring is destroyed on the 25th of March, which was originally New Year's Day in Britain, because it's connected. It's 9 months before Christmas, which incidentally is why we have the tax year that we currently do. When the calendar's changed, the bank still wanted to have a 12-month tax year. Anyway, so those sort of hints are there, but in the Boorman film, there is actually a sex scene between Frodo and Galadriel, um, which is actually reads very amusingly in the script, because all of the other characters are jealous because they all sort of have this sort of fantasy. So he's presenting the characters in these very different ways. There's also a scene where Gimli has to have the password of Moria literally beaten out of him. It's an ancestral memory. So they basically sort of hit him around the head until he sort of has this sort of primal moment where he remembers what the password is. Now, I'm suggesting some of these things are quite frivolous, but in fact, it does build into what I think is a serious version of the film that has great sort of energy and imagination, but also has some very, I think, quite disturbing elements as well. The figure of Saruman is particularly nasty and sinister, and he ends up being the mouth of Sauron. So that relationship that's one of the ways in which I think Boorman is very good at concisely linking Tolkien's various plots. And he also survives at the end, and there seems to be some strange, rather sort of like brutal way he's dealing with the other characters. The hobbits all sort of drift away at the end. Pippin has been dressed as a jester in blood-stained robes by Denethor, suggesting that the previous jester had been murdered. And he becomes sort of quite a forlorn character. Sam and Frodo disappear into the Shire, and the ones that we're left with at the end are Legolas and Gimli, who don't really know where to go, and they end up walking to the seashore and standing on the beach and saying, "Well, this liminal place, this place between the land and sea, is as good a place to any to be." So I think that sort of Boorman, he was trying to find the themes, those themes of alienation, exile, loneliness, failure, despair, also the themes of violence, and also the romantic themes that run through it, and really give them a different twist. Now, the film was never made, but the film that he then made was Excalibur. And he's using similar ideas. I think if it had been made, it would have looked a lot like Excalibur looks, which is this, what I call romantic realism. You get these knights in this sort of amazing armor made by Terry English. And they quickly realized that this was real armor. They could use real weapons and they could really hit each other. But the weapons they're using are so huge and heavy that they're sort of staggering about under the weight of their arms and armor, and also under the weight of history and myth. And so they can barely function. But I think that if the Boorman Lord of the Rings would have been made, it would have been much more, it would have used the imagery, the styling of Excalibur. And it would have been, I think, a visual treat, as well as being a thought-provoking adaptation of the plot.
Yeah. If anyone's listening to this is getting really angry about elements of that, I think it's worth pointing out that it tells us a lot about the point at which it is invented. So was this dreamt up in the early 70s?
Yes, it's the early 70s, and he was a radical sort of bad boy of the film world.
Yeah, so it tells us a lot about the early 70s.
That's what they wanted. But I'm interested you should say that people get angry, and of course that's one of the points which I'm trying to make in the book. It's the idea that people do feel that they own Tolkien. They only own they own a version of him. There's a Tolkien who wrote 2 Middle-earth novels in his lifetime, although one of them doesn't mention Middle-earth. The Hobbit doesn't mention Middle-earth. It's a Middle-earth novel because of what comes after it. So that's all he publishes, apart from a few interviews and so forth. People are fascinated by his letters, but of course the letters were only sent out to individuals and weren't published until the early 1980s. But you certainly find that Tolkien fans, for whom I've got a huge amount of respect, I'm a member of the Tolkien Society, will quote things about, the character Gollum, for example, but that only turns up in a letter that Tolkien is writing, I think, to Pauline Baynes. And then, from the time of the Silmarillion, you've got this sort of huge sort of publishing industry of the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the History of Middle-earth, and a number of subsequent volumes that add a great deal to Middle-earth. But do they add anything to your literary appreciation of The Lord of the Rings? I don't know. I mean, they certainly show you how The Lord of the Rings was put together. But I think that in terms of understanding and trying to enjoy these different adaptations, we have to be sort of quite open-minded about it. Now, the BBC radio adaptation of The Lord of the Rings is generally celebrated because I think that the work that Brian Sibley and Michael Bakewell did on that is a superb, very, very effective radio adaptation. But that takes liberties. From the very beginning, it begins with Gollum being tortured, which was an idea that they discussed with Christopher Tolkien. Of course, Tom Bombadil doesn't appear. He appears in very, very few adaptations. And there are some sort of striking moments where I think Michael Bakewell has rewritten various passages. So it does fit as a radio drama. But if you try to read along with the book, it's not going to work at all. So I think you just have to accept that going into a different medium, it's going to be a different experience. And what you want to do, you want to stir people. You want to stimulate them. That might mean provoking them into thinking about the book by having a radical interpretation. And I think it's good that people feel strongly, but they need to perhaps analyze those feelings and see them as positive rather than dismissing the adaptations. Because whether we like it or not, the adaptations are here to stay.
Yeah, and I think it may have been tough to have that as the first adaptation of Lord of the Rings out there on film. But just like you're saying, we were talking at the beginning about, Macbeth done by a Japanese company or a Russian company is going to be completely different from one done by the RSC. So you have to not worry about the source material being damaged.
It's still there. It's still going to be there.
Still there, everybody. Still there.
Yeah. And I would hope that when if people are, encouraged to go and read the books after seeing the film or to reread the books, they will have a much greater appreciation of the books because they'll be able to sort of see around them in different ways. And then, part of the whole fun, the enjoyment of literary criticism is to have your ideas about character, structure, plot, themes to challenged, and to think about characters in different ways. And sort of see whether they can be reinterpreted. I wanted to add a level of uncertainty to a book which many people seem to think is a very definite book about good versus evil. I don't think it is at all. I think that there are huge questions about, many of the characters and their actions, their attitudes, but that makes them more human. It makes us be able to relate to them. It doesn't diminish them. It sort of shows their shortcomings in ways which is, I think, humane. Yeah.
So just to sort of finish on the BBC radio adaptation, I'd like to go back to the Bakshi cartoon. But I think what they did brilliantly on the radio is they did very good job of the music because they had kind of director's cut extra where if they couldn't fit a song into the radio episode, they would have a bit at the end where you'd get a Treebeard song or something. They really lent into the fact that this is poetry, song, as well as drama. So I thought it was a wonderful adaptation. It's probably still my favourite, actually, because I'm free to use my own imagination on the visuals.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.